Hi, welcome to our presentation, Grouting for Success. This is an AIA certified webinar, so please, if you haven't already done so, fill out your information and we'll be happy to send you a certificate. Our presenter today is Mike Granatowski. He's the Director of Architectural and Commercial Projects for MAPEI. Mike's a graduate of the University of Arizona, where he studied architecture and graduated with a degree in business administration. Mike has worked in the flooring industry for more than 40 years and has specialized in tile and stone installation systems, where he's been involved with the installation, distribution, and sales with a focus on design professionals. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Jen. Good morning, everyone. As she said, my name is Mike Granatowski, just giving you a quick Photoshop of who I am and my background in this. We're going to be talking today about grout and the selection of grout in the tile and stone installation, how to properly select the grout and what to be looking for as you pick out your grout. This is, as Jen mentioned, an AIA continuing education, so please fill out your forms and get it to us. Also, IDCEC, if you need credit for that, we can help you get your appropriate credit for the IDCEC. So let's begin. One of the things about looking at grout in tile installations and my background with the industry is that grout, when you look at it, is about 5% of the cost of the tile installation job. And yet it probably is 95% of our problems due to selecting the grout, how it performs, the makeup of it, various problems that we have with it. And that's usually when we start on a job problem, it's usually something to do with the grout. What we're going to be talking about today is understanding the history of the grout, why it's used, what is grout supposed to do, specifying grout, whether it's a job site mix, factory blended, high performance cements, making sure that you're meeting your owner's expectations of what they expect in their finished tile project. We're going to talk about epoxies, and especially industrial grade of epoxy grouts, and why that's so important and where to specify those and how to use them. And then understand how a better understanding of the many types of grouts can assist you in specifying proper performance for your next tile project. So it's a very critical part of selecting and putting together a tile or stone installation. When we take a look at the history of ceramic tile is one of the oldest forms of construction that we know. The Egyptians had it in the 4th millennium and used it to decorate their houses with blue tile bricks. And in between all of these is, of course, some sort of a mortar or a grout system holding them together, preventing voids in between the individual pieces. Look at some other examples of tile installation in Mesopotamia. One of its famous applications is the Isidore Door of Babylon, considered one of the 7 wonders of the world, decorated with lions and bulls and dragons. And again, in between the individual tiles is a filler or a grout that is used to holding this together, completing the entire installation. Going into Europe and taking a look at West Winchester Cathedral, I've had the opportunity of being there on a couple of occasions. And you look at the age of these floors and the beauty of the tile that's in stone that's used in there. And again, in between those tiles and stones is a grout, definitely a different type than what we use today, but yet it is there protecting the tile and the stone, continuous installation. Another shots of this. Again, showing intricate patterns and designs in the Alhambra Moorish mosaics from the 9th century. And holding these designs together is your grout in between the individual pieces of tile and stone. Grout has been used between the tiles since the beginning of tile. It is typically just a sand and cement. And when I first started in the tile industry, coming out of college and getting into it, a lot of the grout that we did on jobs back then was strictly a mixture of sand and cement and placed between, worked in between the joints of the tile. Coloring was added by using lamp black or cement dyes to getting different types of colors of grout. Typically, the two colors that we had were gray and white, and a lot of times, often wish it was back to that gray and white. Less problems with a lot of colors, but we all do appreciate the color of the grout and how it accentuates a tile installation. And the need for the color and the choices of color becomes a very critical part of the selection process in putting together your tile or stone installation. But eventually iron oxide and other simple pigments were added as base colors and mixed by the installer on site, getting the various colors. I remember doing a red lobster many years ago, where to get a red colored grout, we used an iron oxide red dye into the grout to making a red colored grout for them. Your early cement grouts had a high absorption rate, over 35%, and very easily could stain or be discolored by soil staining spills onto the product. So when we take a look at what we're going to be talking about today is as we look at this history of the ceramic tile grouts or stone grouts, is that we're going to be looking at a couple of different types of products. We're going to look at the standard cement grouts. We're going to get into the high performance cement grouts and what do we mean by these and the difference in the ANSI specification on them. We're going to start looking at something that's relatively new into the industry, is the pre-mixed or ready to use grouts and how they compare to sanded grouts, epoxy grouts, and their place in the installation process. We're going to talk about modified epoxy emulsion grout. And then we're going to get into chemically resistant or 100% solid epoxy grouts and understanding all of the differences on these. So grout, why, of course, why ceramic tile grout? Grout was used to be more than sanitary. It's designed to keep the water out. If you're just budding the tile, you of course would have water seeping through that. It's designed to protect the tile edges. Also, as tile expands and contracts, the grout is in there absorbing some of that movement. It's not a movement joint per se, but it does absorb some of the movement of the tile. Protecting the edges of the tile, you want the grout joints to be full, flush, so that the edges of the tile don't chip or spall in movement. Grout joints also allow for slight irregularity in the substrate and the tile. I like to say that grout can cover a multitude of sins in a tile installation. A very good tile installation that has bad grout installation, you will notice the bad installation. A poor tile installation with a good grout installation will cover up a lot of the mistakes. I often wonder why so many times on a job site that the least trained person will be given over to doing the grouting, where it can be such an important part of the finished look of it. It should be a trained finisher installing that grout, and not just the newest guy on the job getting stuck doing the grouting. Something to think about. When we take a look at the basic Portland cement type grout, we're looking at our ANSI standards A118.6, which is a standard cement grout. And then we also have ANSI 118.7, which is a high performance cement grout. And we're going to get into a discussion on the differences between those types of grouts and what they mean, and as you look at that ANSI specification. The installation of the grout for ANSI follows 108.10, and then our designation on ISO designation for cement grouts is ISO 13007 CG, cementitious grouts. Some of the codes that you'll be familiar with in your specifications as you're calling out the right type of grout. In your ANSI 118.6 standard cement grouts, this is a base of a Portland cement, and then we have other additives into it for the aggregate, a fine sand, and in some cases marble dust. Pigments and dyes are added to it, And then other products are added to it to help slow down the water absorption, to allow it to cure properly after it's been placed, so it doesn't dry out quickly, crack, and check. A Portland cement grout, there's a couple of things to be aware of. That is that it will be highly porous, is susceptible to staining and contaminants. And it doesn't matter what brand of a Portland cement grout, based on the fact that it is a Portland cement grout, some of the properties of it will allow for staining, discoloration, and such, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Consistency in the color can be an issue due to sensitivity to both in the water being used in mixing and the cleanup process. From your basic knowledge of cement, we know that cement doesn't need that much water to hydrate and to turn it hard. But what we have to have is a water of convenience to make the product flow, getting it out and into the places that we want. So typically what happens with a Portland cement grout is that the installer mixing it up will add so much water to it. And on a hot day, he's feeling, oh, this is going to set up, so I'm going to add a little extra water to it. Or once he's got it down onto the substrate and he starts cleaning it up and it's starting to set up on him, he uses more water to clean it up than necessary. So what we end up having is that all this extra water getting into the grout, we start washing out the color, we start fading the grout. And oftentimes, if you're on the job site, look at the wash water that they're throwing away, and you'll see that the color of your grout is going down the drain or out into the ground. So often as the design team, you've specified a mocha colored grout and you come back and find out it looks like latte because the color has been washed away by the use of too much water, both in the mixing and in the cleanup of the grout. And this can be a problem with the Portland cement type grouts. With these type of grouts, we have sanded, which is a sand aggregate added into it. The sand is used as an aggregate, is what's holding the cement particles together. It all locks together, forming a uniform mass. Thinking of it similar to a concrete, when you add cement and gravel and other aggregates forming a concrete, grout is in the same classification. For a sanded grout, we're typically going 1/8 of an inch or greater. That allows for the sand to be worked down into the joint, filling the joint, consistent filling of the joint. It's the most common grout. Absorption rates can be as high as 10%. With the additives that are placed into these grouts, you're still going to have a higher absorption rate, up to as 10%. And we have to be careful. They may scratch sensitive finishes like a polished stone or some glasses or a metal tile. So before you take these grouts and start applying them onto a finished project, test the tile, the stone that you're working with, or the glass, to making sure that this grout won't scratch it as it's being applied. With an unsanded grout, you're going to fill in joints from 1/8 of an inch to 1/16 of an inch. The aggregate in an unsanded grout is typically a marble dust. You still have an aggregate going into it, holding the cement together, filling in the joint. This unsanded is most often used for wall tile, glass, stone tiles. The absorption rate on this can be as high as 18%. And again, you can still get the fading out of the color by overwashing, overmixing of these grouts. So what we have on the options on your basic Portland cement grouts is polymer modified. And originally, as the colored grouts were coming out a number of years back, it was the sand and cement, the aggregates into it, the pigments and the dyes into it. And then the industry started introducing more and more usage of polymers. So the first generations of polymer mixed grout or polymer modified grout was a liquid applied to the grout. And then most of the manufacturers now have moved to where a dry polymer is mixed into the grout at the factory, so you're not guessing how much liquid to put in. And then when you add water at the job site, it emulsifies the polymer, and making your polymer modified grout. The benefits of adding a polymer into the grout is that it brings out the color a lot better in the various colors, improves the color retention. It does lower the absorption rate. The polymer does slow down products absorbing into the grout, doesn't make it waterproof or stain proof. It does also improve tensile, flexural, and compressive strengths of the grout. Just like when we add polymers into mortars, the same things are happening. This type of a grout should be sealed. Staining, spills on it will stain the grout, and so consequently after it cures, a sealer should be applied to this type of a grout. Some of the other options is that what we're seeing with these types of grouts is that we're starting to see maximizers or boosts, additives placed into the grout, even though they're polymer modified, to again helping increase stain resistance, reducing the need for sealing, in some cases no sealing required after curing. These boosts or additives do not affect the color stays the same, in some cases even intensifies it. It does help repel dirt and stains, it reduces water absorption and gives it a better flexural strength, and also reduces the shrinkage of some of the Portland cement grouts. It does also help with the improved cleaning maintenance on a regular maintenance of your Portland cement by adding these boosts or these additives into the Portland cement grouts. The pros of using a Portland cement grout or grouts that comply with ANSI 118.6, they are cost competitive. They're suitable for most applications except when chemical resistance is needed. The cons, it is a cement. It can end up being soft and powdery if it's been overmixed or overwatered or too much water used in cleaning up. It should be sealed. It can end up inconsistent in color. As an example, if 2 or 3 of us are doing a floor and I start in the back corner of the room and you're near a window where the sun is beating in and somebody else is by an open door, I can almost guarantee you that the shading of this grout will not be the same going across this floor because of the various things affecting the drying time of this grout. So you can end up with inconsistent color. The other thing with the Portland cement grout is that it is prone to having efflorescence. In the curing process of the grout, the cement produces a free lime. That free lime, as water gets into the grout, is brought up to the surface of the grout. Water can evaporates, and that white chalky residue remains, your efflorescence. This is a problem with a Portland cement grout, and it can happen after the grout's been installed because of rain or excessive mopping of the floor, or it can happen right after it's installed because too much water was used in the mixing of the grout or the cleaning up of the grout. But the efflorescence can be a problem with these grouts. We take a look next at the ANSI 118.7, the high performance cement grouts. Typically this is a non-Portland cement, but it's a calcium aluminate cement, or it's a rapid setting cement that's used rather than Portland cement. It is faster setting. It has little to no susceptibility of efflorescence. In other words, the salts are not coming up to the surface because there's a lot less produced in this type of a cement in the curing process of the free lime. It has a lot lower porosity than a standard grout, typically less than 5%, and consequently better color consistency and resistance to staining. This type of a grout, if 3 of us are in that same room again and I'm working in the corner and somebody's under the bright sun in the window and somebody's working by the open door, the consistency of the color will be pretty much the same across the floor. This grout tends to cure from the inside out rather than from the outside in. So less effect by the elements of bright sun beating on it or wind blowing across it. And consequently, with this type of a grout, you are going to have a more color consistent finish. It does have less shrinkage and less water absorption. One of the advantages of this grout is that if you're in a project where or you need to get it submerged into water, within 72 hours, we can submerge this grout and it's cured out to where there won't be a problem with it. So this is a great application for exterior use where inclement weather could be coming in. The weather won't affect, if we can keep that covered for 72 hours, rain and such won't affect that grout. Does have a higher compressive strength and tensile strength, also flexural strength. And we've seen the development of a universal formula to this that we can use anywhere from a 1/16 of an inch up to a 1-inch grout joint, and you won't have cracking or checking. So you don't have both a sanded and an unsanded. It's just one product, and the aggregate on it that we're using with this product will allow you to go from that tight joint all the way up to a 1-inch wide grout joint. Again, if you have a sensitive finish, glass, certain stones, metal tile, test it first before you start smearing the whole area and then find out you're scratching the surface. When you look at the ISO standards on these grouts, and we see ISO standards being used, of course, here in the States to some degree, and then internationally quite a bit. It falls under ISO 13007, a C1 cement or a C2 standard or an improved, and then the various characteristics. F for a fast setting, a rapid setting grout. A for a high abrasion resistance. W for reduced water absorption. So this is the classification of an ANSI 118.7 grout and also the ISO standards for that. Now we start taking a look at epoxy grouts and getting into the use, or excuse me, not the epoxy grouts, the ready-to-use grouts, excuse me. Jumped ahead of myself. This is something relatively new on the market in the last couple of years, to where rather than going in and mixing up a grout, the cement grout with water, you're going into the job, bring out the bucket, open the bucket, and the product is ready to use. There's no mixing involved. You take it out and you start spreading it like you would a mixed cement grout. The standard on these ready-to-use grouts is that they're a polymer resin grout. It's a one part ready to use that require no mixing with water. They may require various water-based polymers, including acrylics or urethanes, and fillers that may be sanded or unsanded. The appropriateness of these grouts for commercial use or water exposure or exterior application varies widely. So check with the manufacturer of these grouts before you start saying, I can use this anywhere. There are no ANSI standards yet for this grout. This is being worked on, coming up with a standard of how the grout is being put together, whether it's an acrylic based or a urethane based, how that's going to affect the ANSI standard on it. But if you're looking for an ANSI standard on this, there isn't at this time. So it's the best is to check with the manufacturer to make sure where these grouts can be appropriately used without a problem. For the most cases, we don't want to use these in a submerged application, or if it's going to be on an exterior application where it's going to be sitting in rain-soaked or under ice and snow or ice. We're seeing a lot of success on commercial applications because of the ease of use of this product, and they don't require sealing. We're talking about the ANSI standard for this type of a grout is underway. The materials and methods has defined a series of tests that will define this type of product. The standard is close to being ready, and you'll be hearing more of that as it does come out. So there will be a standard on it, hopefully soon. The pros and cons of these ready-to-use grouts. Pros is it's ready to use, there's no mixing. So you're not adding too much water into it. You're not over mixing it. It can be used from a 1/16 of an inch up to a 1/2 inch grout joint. Another advantage is that the container can be resealed. So let's say you're doing a project And you have some of this grout left over at the end. You can put the lid on it. And there it is, attic stock, if there's a repair that has to be done. And typically this resealed grout will last up to a year, and can be used for a touch-up or repair. And you'll have the same color, the same shading as the original installation. You will not get efflorescence from it because there is not a Portland cement in it. It is a color consistent, dust free because there's no mixing involved, no color fading, flexible, great crack resistance, no sealer needed ever. Sealer just doesn't stick to it, so you're not sealing it. The cons with this grout, it's limited chemical resistance. It's slower to cure in low temperatures and moist environment. And I want to talk a little bit more on this chemical resistance, making sure that there's a lot of advertising that goes on in these grouts, similar to epoxy grouts. Don't get this confused with an epoxy. Look at what these types of products, these ready-to-use grouts, can be used for. Heavy commercial or heavy sanding, soiling, heavy chemical use. It's not like an epoxy. They will break down under those types of conditions. So making sure that you're specifying this grout in the area that where you expect it to be used and not in a heavy commercial application. Slower cure times with them, 24 hours for light traffic, 7 days for cleaning. And like I mentioned earlier, limited water resistance and limited use exteriors. Don't use this in a pool, a fountain, in a gang shower, or in areas subject to continuous water. Residential use in the bathroom, showers, absolutely, no problem at all. So then now we get into looking at the epoxy reaction resin grouts. First, at an ANSI standard we're looking at is ANSI 118.8, the modified epoxy emulsion mortar or grout. And then the other ones we'll be talking about is ANSI 118.3, chemically resistant water cleanable tile setting epoxy and grout. And then the application standard on that is ANSI 108.6. When we talk about and the ISO standard on that is 13007 RG, reaction resin grouts. So we'll talk firstly about the modified epoxy emulsion grouts. In the 80s, we were seeing a lot of this. And basically what you were working with was a resin and a hardener, but the aggregate for the color was typically a Portland cement grout that was being added into it for the color. It had, this type of a product had a lot of properties of an epoxy in that the strengths and such, but one of the things is that it still was a Portland cement, and in under certain circumstances, what would affect a Portland cement would affect this grout. So you had to be careful with it in using it in a commercial application, subject to high greases or high cleaning and such. You had to make sure that that type of a product, this emulsion epoxy, would break down in those applications. They were not 100% solids epoxies. These materials were primarily used to bond tile, and that was probably the first area that we were seeing is that what was a quick way of bonding a tile to a plywood flooring, for example. This modified epoxy would use. And then and not all of the manufacturers were recommending these products as a grout, but quite a bit of it was. We're not seeing this specification that much anymore with the use of the solids epoxies and the changes with them that we'll be discussing in a minute. So then we take a look at the use of resin-based epoxy grouts. Chemically resistant, water cleanable tile setting and a grouting epoxy. And epoxy composition, 100% solids system. It's composed of an epoxy resin and a hardener, and contains an aggregate as a fill. You're seeing these grouts either as a 2-part or a 3-part system. Remember, it is a thermal set cure. And why the importance of that and being aware of that in working with these grouts once they're mixed, it's getting them out of the bucket, setting them onto the floor, getting them into the area that you're going to be using them, spreading them out so that they don't cure as fast as if you keep it in the bucket where you have a mass and it's putting off more heat. You can feel the bucket warming up if you leave it in the bucket for a while. Get it out onto the floor to start spreading it out to making it easier to work with. After mixing, but before curing, it can be cleaned, emulsified with water, or in other words, water cleanable. There's a lot of differences with these grouts. When I first started in the industry and when we were working with epoxy grouts, really difficult to work with. In most cases, you needed to use hot water to get them clean. A lot of times we would be pre-sealing the tile so that the epoxy would come off of it that much easier. I had to be careful where, dumping the residue. I had a real interesting learning experience many years ago where we weren't paying attention and we didn't cover drains properly at a winery. And the epoxy wash-off water went down this drain and it all hardened, and it cost us to come in there and tear up the drains because the drains got plugged from this epoxy water and epoxy getting into the drain and solidifying in that. So there was a lot more involved with working with these types of products, more difficult to work with. And we've seen a lot of changes with the epoxy grouts over the last number of years to where they're a lot easier to work with, even being 100% solids epoxy. A lot of times when you're talking to an installer, they'll give you different reasons for why they don't want to use the epoxy. And most cases, they're just not comfortable in working around with it. They've had maybe they had bad experiences in the past, and they don't want to go through that experience again. But you can find that these epoxy grouts are a lot easier to work with now than what they used to be. In some cases, because of the way that the aggregate is put into it, a lot of times grouting with an epoxy with a very dark grout, like a black grout, I find it easier grouting with an epoxy than a cement grout. When you look at the chemically resistant water cleanable, ANSI 118.3, both tile setting and a grouting epoxy. Early formulas, like I mentioned, were difficult to use. The early formulas had very few colors to choose from. Nowadays, when you look at the epoxy grouts, the range of colors is the same as what you're finding in the Portland cement and the calcium aluminum cement grouts. Multiple colors are available with it. Typically, they were used only on commercial or industrial applications, or where chemical resistance was needed. And that was most of the time was the only time that you would see the application with it. Of course, they are highly resistant to chemicals and staining. One of the things I want you to be very much aware of, an epoxy grout is not a waterproof grout. Believe it or not, I had a call not too many weeks ago from a company that said, we're ready to install the grout. And what grout is waterproof? Isn't the epoxy a waterproof grout? And if you're thinking that your grout is going to waterproof your job, you've got a problem. The waterproofing has to start first. Epoxy, although it's a plastic, and if you were to spread it out as a full uniform surface across an area, yes, it would hold water. But between the tile and the grout, you can still form a little crack or a little void. Water could get in there, and they could affect the waterproofing of your job. So epoxy grout is not a waterproofing. Waterproofing starts before you start the installation of the tile. Keep that in mind. It's crazy to get those questions, but they do come up. When you take a look at where we're going with epoxy grouts, we're seeing it more and more often being used on residential and in other applications where you want color consistency and you don't want to go into staining of the grout or ease of cleaning. The Coca-Cola spilling on it, the red wine, the spaghetti sauce. This will clean up off the grout and you'll end up with a consistent color. The newer formulas are a lot friendlier and easier to clean, a lot easier to work with and clean up both in the during the applications. As I said, we see more and more use of it in residential because of its stain resistance. And you've picked a very light colored grout on your residential kitchen, and you don't want it turning dark over a period of time. So using an epoxy will help prevent that from staining down and turning dark on you. Of course, many more colors are now available, and we've even seen getting into decorative grouts where some companies offer glitter and to glow in the dark type grouts with the epoxy grouts. So a lot of variations, a lot of applications in selecting an epoxy grout. Common uses of epoxy grouts, of course, in your 100% solids is your commercial kitchens, meat processing plants, your milking barns, dairies, anywhere where you have more of a caustic type applications. Bathrooms, commercial dog kennels, industrial grade areas that are vulnerable to maintenance with enzymatic and no rinse cleaners. What we're talking about here now is your industrial grade of epoxy grout. Where are we starting to use that and the differences in that? When we take a look at the industrial grade of epoxy grout, how this came about, what we were looking at, what's different with it. Probably, oh gosh, it's got to be about 10 years ago, ran into this for the first time where on an application we were called in and the architect called me and there was a project at a hospital in the kitchen area where he doing his year walkthrough on the project. And he calls and he says, Mike, the grout is disappearing. The grout is gone in certain areas. And we went and looked at this job, and sure enough, you could take your finger and run it through the grout joint, and the grout felt like almost like sawdust. What happened to the grout? And we knew it was an epoxy grout. In our investigation, what we found out that they had changed cleaning practices, and what they started using were enzymatic cleaners, or these no rinse cleaning solutions for maintaining the kitchen floor. If you've ever had to mop a kitchen floor or a bar room floor or any area there where you're doing a cleanup, these enzymatic cleaners, these no rinse cleaners as they're called, what a godsend. You mop them down, squeegee it off, walk away, no rinsing, and the next day you got a clean floor. All well and good. What ended up happening is that in the testing of these cleaners, we didn't recognize, or the industry didn't recognize, what would happen when they were mixed in with certain food products, and that they would, how that would attack the grout. And what we found out is that these cleaners mixed with certain food products, especially olive oils, chicken fat, form what's called an oleic acid. This oleic acid is very caustic and will eat up a traditional epoxy grout. We never had this problem years ago when I was first working with epoxies because we didn't have these enzymatic cleaners. They were just mopping the floor, squeegeeing it down, rinsing the floor, the typical cleaning. With these enzymatic cleaners, it changed things. The manufacturing of epoxy grout had to go back to the drawing table, and we came out with the industrial grade of epoxy grouts. As you can see, we have different testings to it to making sure that it'll hold up to the combination of these food acids and the enzymatic cleaners, and these types of grouts will stand up in your commercial kitchen applications. A lot of times the industrial grade of epoxy grouts compared to the furan in its physical strength and chemical resistance. Furan was a type of industrial grade of an epoxy grout that was used years ago, very difficult to work with. It's still on the market a little bit. You don't see it that often. But with manufacturers now, these industrial grade grouts, what we've come out with stand up to the comparisons of the furan. If you're doing a commercial kitchen, as a design team, as an architect, you don't know how the owner is going to clean it later on down the road. You don't know what products that they're going to be using. We highly recommend that you stay with an industrial grade of an epoxy grout for that back of the house, for that kitchen. They are limited in colors. You don't see the wide range of colors with it. but these are grouts that will hold up and perform the way that your owner expects it to, and give you the life expectancy out of that back of the house, that kitchen floor, that industrial floor. Keep that in mind when you go into the specification. The pros of these highly water cleanable epoxy grouts, again, an epoxy grout, no sealer is needed, very color consistent, less costly in maintenance because you're not sealing it, and staining comes off of it. You spill the ketchup on it, spill the coffee on it in the restrooms, problems in the restrooms, you're not going to end up with a stained grout. Good for both wall and floor applications. Most manufacturers have, if needed, have epoxy mortars along with the epoxy grouts. A lot of times epoxy mortars will be used when there's a heavy need, or a need for more acid resistance. For example, in a dairy or winery or brewery, the acids that are produced from these products, not only will you use an epoxy grout, but you'll set the quarry or the pavers with also an epoxy mortar. So it's all locks together, bonds together. They do have, like I say, a good workability and water cleanability. They're a lot easier to work with than what they were years ago. The cons for an epoxy grout, they're usually 2 or 3 parts. They have to be mixed precisely. When you come out with a unit and you only have a small area to do, don't let the installer or yourself try to be a chemist and say, oh, I'll only mix up a half a unit and it'll work. The unit is designed to be used complete, and that means if you've got to mix up a complete unit and you're only using part of it and the rest of it's being thrown away, so be it. If you're not using all of the parts to their fullest, you may end up with a failed grout. The grout might not harden properly or become soft because all of the chemical, all of the product is needed to get the proper set with it. It's like baking a cake. If you don't put in all of the ingredients, it's not going to turn out. Similarly with these epoxy grouts, all of the ingredients from the different components going into mixing up the unit must be used. There's a shorter working time. Of course, pot life, because as I mentioned earlier, it's a thermal set. If you don't get the grout out of the bucket, it can start setting off and giving you less working time with it. The other important thing is as you're doing a couple of units of epoxy, clean the bucket before you start mixing another unit into that bucket, or use a fresh bucket, because the residual from the older epoxy that you used 30 minutes ago is setting up, and that will also cause the newer epoxy to start setting up faster. So either make sure that the bucket is completely clean before you mix into it again, or use a fresh bucket for each batch that you're mixing up to give yourself the proper working time. Yes, cleanup can be a little more challenging than cement grouts, but if worked at, if trained properly, it is not that much more difficult. Some installers do develop, it is a resin, some installers do develop an allergic reaction to it. It can happen. They don't seem to be as caustic as what they were years ago. Yes, we still hear of once in a while somebody being allergic to it, but not as often as what it used to be. An epoxy, you do need an experienced installer in working with it. If this is the first time that the installer is working with an epoxy, he should be doing some mock-ups before he starts it on your floor. And they are definitely more expensive to use, both in the cost of the materials and in labor. The other thing to keep in mind is that using an epoxy grout, the curing times on these. So if you're doing a commercial kitchen and you're trying to do a repair in it, the fact is that we do need the curing time on it to be covered and protecting it. Been often asked, can't you get an epoxy that can set up quicker so we can get these repairs done and we have less downtime on the kitchen? We could set up an epoxy that would set up quicker, but the good chance that you might not get it out of the bucket, you'd be throwing most of it away. So we are limited in how quick an epoxy can set up and being able to work with it. And it's a matter, if you're doing a repair, properly covering it so it can cure out properly before you put the application back into use. Being aware of those conditions with epoxy. The other thing about with epoxies, remember one thing: in direct sunlight, the lighter colors can be UV sensitive, just like if you're working with epoxies on a surfboard or any other type of a plastic application under UV light, lighter colors can tend to yellow over a period of time. Similarly, your lighter colors of epoxy may tend to yellow. Check with the manufacturer if that becomes a concern, making sure what they tell you regarding their epoxy grout. When you look at the ISO standards on your epoxy grout, it's a reaction resin. They're higher performance characteristics than approved cementitious grouts. So the ISO standard 13007 RG is what you're looking at that. So when you look at cement-based grouts, you have your job site mix. That's where a gentleman may be pulling together sand and cement, pigments going into it to mix up. It's good. Better is, of course, going into your factory blended polymer modified grouts. It's still complying with ANSI 118.6. And then your best on your high performance grouts is your 118.7. Exterior applications, you're selling yourself short if you're not specifying at least an ANSI 118.7 grout for any type of an exterior application. On your reaction or your resin grouts or epoxy grouts, ready to use, pre-mixed grouts are good. Remember, you'll see a lot of advertising that says, like an epoxy, has characteristics of an epoxy. Check with the manufacturer to what they really mean. What are they telling you that it'll do? Some of the characteristics of an epoxy, it may stand up to ketchup, Coca-Cola, coffee, urine. But will it stand up to harsh cleaning of 100% solids epoxy? Find out before you just jump into these ready-to-use type grouts and thinking that they're going to perform like an epoxy. Your better, of course, is your chemically resistant, water cleanable, 100% solids epoxy, complying with ANSI 118.3. And then your best for your industrial applications is the industrial grade of epoxy. Back of the house, keep this in mind, always use an industrial grade of an epoxy. That way you're not going to have a problem a year down the road, 2 years down the road, grout failing on you. We're going to talk a little bit about movement joints. That again, this is part of it. Grout joints and the movement joints are all part of it. The design team always, of course, is saying, doesn't like to see movement joints into their finished tile work. Taking a look at the requirements for both interior, exterior, and alternating requirements. Previously, for movement joints in your finished tile work, interior requirements were every 24 to 36 feet in both directions and around perimeter walls, columns, or any dissimilar surface. You had to have a soft joint in your finished tile work. Exterior requirements were every 12 to 16 feet. And then interior exposed to direct sunlight, whether like, for example, a showroom, an automobile showroom where you've got the big picture windows in there. You want it to be every 12 to 16 feet, or on above ground concrete slabs every 12 to 16 feet. In 2011, we saw some changes in the standards in EJ 171, and we went to interior spans of movement joints every 20 to 25 feet. Exterior was every 8 to 12 feet, and then on the alternates, 8 to 12, 8 to 12. 2017, we saw another redoing of the movement joints, and what we were looking at now is a maximum on an interior, of 25 feet. Exterior maximum is 12 feet, and then the alternates for direct sunlight or a raised concrete slab is 12 feet. The placement of these movement joints, you as architects, the design team, working with the contractor in the layout, but you're the one stating where you want them to go, making sure that they're going around the perimeters and around columns and dissimilar surfaces. to protect your total tile installation, tile or stone installation. Making sure that when the joint goes in, there's a flexible backer rod that goes into it before the placement of the soft urethane sealant that goes into the joint that acts as the movement joint. Again, following along with EJ 171 in the TCNA handbook, this is the best layout and the best explanation of the movement joints and how they are used and placed. Often I get the request, we want the movement joint to be the same size as the grout joint and we're using a narrower grout joint. Can that be done? Yes, it can be. There's mathematical formulas involved with it. It has to do with the expansion of the tile. And then what ends up happening, you're going to have a lot more movement joints into the overall floor to achieve that type of look, but it can be done. Have questions on that, refer to the manual or give your supplier of your setting material company a call, and we're glad to work with you in helping you figure this out. Again, the width of the movement joint will be determined by the spacing and coefficient of thermal expansion of the tile or the natural stone. EJ 171 will contains a chart and equations to help determine the proper joint width. So refer to that. Making sure then that the sealant that you're using in your movement joint will perform the way you want it to perform, that it has the right elongation, the right shore hardness, that's designed to be used for a walking surface if that's where you're using it, making sure that a proper sealant is placed into those joints. And again, the guidelines and movement joints and walls are also addressed in EJ 171. And again, on walls, as you look at corners, interior, external corners, soft joints should be placed there, especially when you're looking outside. The amount of expansion contraction based on direct sunlight has a major impact on the installation for an exterior application. And without the proper movement joints in the proper places, you will end up with a failure on your tile installation or your tile or stone installation. And this is what we're trying to prevent. So in summary, remember a couple of things. All grout is not created equal. Portland cement grout, it can stain, it can effloresce, you can have these problems. Even on a properly mixed and properly installed heavy rain on it, and you can have efflorescence. Is that the installer's problem? No, it's the nature of the beast with a Portland cement grout. Make sure that you specify the grout based on the use, the type of tile, and the expectations of the job site. Explaining it to your owner that if you don't want to be maintaining the grout and sealing it and the possibility of it staining, a Portland cement grout or a cement grout, period, might not be the way of going. There are very harsh cleaning materials being used to maintain floors in commercial kitchens that are detrimental to tile grouts. Make sure that the new generation of industrial grouts are what you're using in your commercial kitchens. It's the only solution. It is a solution that'll work. The life and performance of your project depends upon the attention to the proper selection of grout, and then making sure that the movement joints are properly installed per EJ 171 in the TCNA handbook. Like I said earlier at the very beginning of this presentation, the grout is about 5% of the cost of the job, and yet it's about 95% of our problems. By selecting the right grout, making sure that you're picking out the right grout, the right color, the right installation of it, we can eliminate a lot of problems from the job. Thank you. If you have any questions, we'll open it up right now.
Yeah, Mike, actually, there are some questions. The first one is they are asking if they could make a special color grout. Can they mix two different colors together to do this?
This comes up on a regular basis. You look at a manufacturer's range of colors and manufacturers 30, 40 different colors of grout, and somebody says, that's not the exact color I want. Can I take this bag of mocha and this bag of chocolate and mix it together and come up with my own color? You can, but you're playing scientist. And are you going to be able to recreate that same color the next time? Are you going to get the right blend out of it? Chances are, if you have to mix up a second batch of it, it won't be the same. It's done. It's not recommended because you'll never be able to get that full blend of two different colors the same way. So we don't recommend it.
Great, thank you. And the next question, any idea when ANSI will have a standard for ready-to-use grouts?
We've been hoping on this for the last year and a half. There's some people in our company that work at MAPEI that are on the committees doing the testing along with our competition from other companies and getting this to that point. And hopefully within the next year or less, we'll see an ANSI standard on the ready-to-use grouts.
Oh, that's a good one. Well, and the last question, should I seal the grout?
Any Portland cement or any cement grout is porous. Take a look at your sidewalk. When a sidewalk goes in, it's a bright gray. It looks great. Over a period of time, as you walk on that along the center of the sidewalk, it gets darker because you're impacting dirt into it. Things get spilled on it along the edges. It always kind of stays to a lighter color. Grout is the same way. Although you've got this beautiful color, you've picked out a beautiful light color. Over a period of time, as you're walking on it, dirt is being impacted into the grout, and it's getting it darker. So to help prevent grout from changing colors, getting darker, sealing should be done on any type of cement, whether it's a Portland cement or a calcium aluminate cement grout. It is still a cement grout, and it should be sealed.
That's good to know. Thank you. If there are any other questions after the fact, please go ahead and always send them to us. You can reach us at mapeidigital@mapei.com, and we'll be happy to forward them on to Mike and make sure that you get the right answer. Mike, thank you very much for your presentation. Everybody, thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate your time today. And that concludes this presentation of Grouting for Success. Please be sure if you're interested in sending us your contact information for the AIA certification. Thanks again. Bye-bye.